Dr. Mestenhauser, I'm wondering, why do you believe that we should have international education?
Well, that's a good question, because after 50 years my European friends are posing that question without giving the answer, but they are critical of it anyway. So I'm delighted that you asked this question out here too. The response to that, of course, is three ways, and it kind of requires some level of conceptualization before I can answer that.
Well, could you tell us a little bit then about, could you elaborate on that? I mean, what are some of the general points then about this particular frame?
Well, and I think there are some, the general points that I would like to make is, basically that international education is catching up with what we have neglected to do for many years. The rest of the world was here all along, but we really ignored that because the U.S. was in a system of isolationism, and so was Britain, for example, and so on. And so we had a problem with that. It's also, but as I suggested earlier, because the antecedent is ethnocentrism, then international education is also supposed to correct ethnocentrism. Correct, obviously, the ignorance that exists among general people, even media as well, too, and understanding the role of culture is one of the major whys, because culture is not something that you touch and see to describe, how it's behaving.
Right.
So it's an abstraction. So that's a very difficult thing for people to understand, and that international education should explain that. But most importantly, I think it's to place the United States as part of the universe, which we have not really seen ourselves to be, and I'm hoping, that would be the case.
Yes. You mentioned ethnocentrism, too, and also then some frameworks. But I'm wondering, could you please define ethnocentrism as you see it?
Yeah, I think I picked up a definition from a political scientist by the name of Lim, and he happens to be from Singapore, so, he has a perspectives on that, and he describes ethnocentrism as the take-for-granted belief that one's own value system practices are the standards by which all other cultures should be judged. Now that's not just the U.S., I think that the Chinese have the same kind of a problem with ethnocentrism. The Japanese for a long time also. So it's a general problem, not just U.S. problem out here.
Right. In terms of examples, how do you see it in international education, or where do you see it?
You're simply judging people by our standards. You're projecting our way of thinking and so on into others, expecting emerging nations, there is a whole lot of them, since the 60s, for example, to adjust to us rather than the other way around. And we seem to feel that we are the world power, so we don't need to do any adjusting. But that's one of the problems. If you take the system's perspectives, everything has to be adjusting and changing and so on too.
Right.
Now, I mentioned already not trusting the knowledge that we have not produced ourselves, expecting newcomers who come as individuals, like immigrants and so on, to also instantly adjust themselves to our culture out here too. And also, the idea, the ethnocentric idea that we have the best institutions of all kinds, including universities and other institutions out here.
Before we move on to a point that you raised earlier, and it'll be the topic of a second video, I'm wondering, when you talked about a conceptual frame, I was wondering if you could elaborate a little bit on it. I believe we had talked about earlier that there were 4 points to it, and can you say a little bit more about those, please?
Well, any time that you deal with a complex system as international education, and it means the world and the pedagogy of it and so on, you need to take into account the fact that you deal with both individuals and institutions and the whole system. So the level of analysis, it's part of the systems thinking out here.
Right, right.
And I can elaborate a little bit on that a little later on. Also, the level of abstraction is important because you deal with the cultures of other countries, and that one operates on different levels of abstraction as well. Now, to explain the way that the culture works, I think my favorite book and almost a Bible is the one by Ross.
Yes, yes.
And he identified 8 differences between anthropology, for example, which deals with the cultural aspects that we deal with, and with social and cognitive psychology. Then the first one is that social psychology is looking for universals.
Right, right.
And, that's one of the problems that we have. You develop a questionnaire, you immediately translate it into 15 languages, and you administer it everywhere on the assumption that what you are testing is universal, looking for the universal truth. And social psychology also has a focus mostly on causation, and you can see that on television too. Right. Even the reporters on the news and so on always ask who caused what. Right. That's our baggage, that we have. Whereas anthropology is looking more for meanings and for understanding.
Right.
And I think understanding is actually more important sometimes than knowledge, because it stems from knowledge, but it goes much deeper than that.
Right.
So we need to develop much deeper understanding that social psychology does not develop out here. Both of them have different research traditions. Of course, social psych is still stuck with the positivistic approach, mostly quantitative kind of research, and that one captures only the questions that you ask and ignores many others that you don't even know, whereas anthropology is using more the ethnographic type of research methodology, which is qualitative out here. Now, social psychology is basically looking for the relationship between individuals and groups, so they mostly focus on individuals out here.
Right.
Whereas anthropology is focusing both on individuals and their institutions and on the society at large, I think, too. The fifth difference out here is that social psychology, being quantitative, assumes that a society is sum total of individuals. And it's not working, because groups of people have their own dynamics.
Right, yes.
And that's completely missed, of course. But also social psychology then is arrested to the day that you are making the administration of the questionnaire out here. And usually out of context, so that you don't really know what you are dealing with out here. The worst part of social psychology is that they look at culture as just one other variable.
Right.
And then finally, in the statistical way of looking at things, they focus on averages.
Yeah.
Whereas social anthropology, cultural anthropology, and so on, are looking at a much greater variety of ranges of people out here.
Great. Thank you very much, Dr. Mestenhauser.